Begin the current Daf Mesechtas Daf Lamed Beis. Begin 16 lines down at the top of the Yomim, where we continue with Halacha, the next Mishnah, continue on the Isuri of Yom Tov, and also the same word we find Peiches in regarding, we spoke about in the previous Mishnah, regarding if you could be Peiches, you could destroy a building initially to get the produce behind it. So we have a similar concept regarding Peiches in the Saner, regarding pushing in a lamp in its creation, regarding that prohibition. She's corresponds because the Nechezka to Anin Daf Chaim B'Shem is joining us for today's Daf. Something we're going to discuss in today's Daf are binyan and steel related structures, and as it relates to Kalim, permitted and forbidden methods of preparing and lighting fires on Yom Tov, fashioning wigs, preparing a temporary structure, clearing an oven, and other halachas that relate to permissible and forbidden actions on Yom Tov. In the key terms, the concept we discussed in today's Daf are Gemar Malacha L'Kabel Tumah. Generally, for somebody to be susceptible and vulnerable to Tumah, has to have been finished. And the question is regarding what is considered that state. Masa Hazav is the halacha that when a Zav carries, moves something, causes a state of Tumah. Tikkun Mana, which we have many halachas related to this, which is under the rubric of Makah B'Patish, which is one of the Lamates Malachas, is that when you finish something, you make it into a vessel, that's considered a prohibition of Makah B'Patish. So we begin the current Daf Lamed Beis in the Mishnah. The Mishnah begins, Ein Peiches es Haner. You cannot take, as this picture illustrates, that a clump, it's called Bitzim Shal Yetzer, it's a clump of pottery, and to push your fist into it, why would you do that? Because you'd want to make a lamp, where they have their lamps made of earthenware. So on that, the Mishnah is saying, Ein Peiches es Haner. You can't push in the lamp to make that concave, and they show basically because that's making a vessel. So it's prohibited to do that on Yom Tov. So to ve'enoisin b'chamin b'Yom Tov. You're not allowed to make charcoal on Yom Tov because that's also a vessel for the goldsmiths. It's a discussion exactly what exactly that is, but since that's also considered as fashioning a kli, therefore that's also prohibited to make b'chamin on Yom Tov. And ve'en chaychin es hapsila. And I'll go ahead and cut a wick, because a wick is also a kli for lighting, where you need to make it and fix it and prepare it. So you're not allowed to either cut a wick. However, he says chaytcha b'ur. What you could do, the Gemara is going to explain exactly why would it be different cutting it with, let's say, a scissor or a knife than it is by the fire. But he says you could cut it with lighting a fire. So the Gemara first says, Mantana, who's the Tana by Mishnah that the pchis is ner, that going out and pushing your hand into the clay is manu, is making it into a vessel, meaning even before you went and you burnt it and you fired it up in the kiln, which that's actually when you usually go ahead and you finish something, it's not really used to light until you fire up in the kiln. Who holds that? No, just pushing your fist in, you already made tikkun man, and therefore it's prohibited to be done on Yom Tov. So the Gemara actually gives two different possibilities of who is the Tana that holds that opinion. So Amr Rabbi Yosef, this is Remeir, the time like learn a Brisa. Kli cheres, an earthenware vessel. From when is it susceptible to receive and become tamei as a kli? So on that, the first opinion says, when you finish the construction, which is carving out of the vessel, that's Divri Remeir. So you see, according to Remeir, just pushing in your fist into the clay, making it into a receptacle, already makes it into a kli, and hence, of course, you wouldn't be able to do that on Yom Tov, like our Mishnah says, because you're making it into a kli. Yeshua, he says, no, it's when you strengthen it by heating it up in the fire of the furnace, then it would be considered as a kli. So you see that the time of Mishnah would be like Remeir. The question is, only Abaya says to Rav Yosef, he says, B'mai, where do you know that Remeir would hold like the halacha of our Mishnah regarding a lamp, like other earthenware vessels that he's talking about? Dilmad can come Remeir Hasan. Maybe where do we find Remeir over here by other earthenware vessels which are very large? And yes, if you didn't heat up an oven, we know that earthenware pottery, it's a piece of earth. It's soft. It's not really. It's when you heat up in the fire that becomes a vessel. So even though you can't put water in it and wine in it or other wet things, liquids, because it would totally dissolve the earthenware. But the thing is, but it is fit to receive and put other things that are dry goods like produce. So I could understand why Rameh would hold, even by just finishing the receptacle, even though you didn't heat it up and turn it into earthenware, why it would be considered as a kli. But Abul Hacha over here by the lamp, which is very small, and if it's not fit for its utility of lighting something because it's still earth, you have to make it into earthenware, to pottery. So l'may chazi, what's it fit when you just pushed your fist into it? What are you going to use it for? It's so small. It's a very little hole that you put in the oil. Says Gemara, yes, it is still worth. You could still put in coins. You could put in a few pennies inside, and therefore it is a receptacle even when it's moist, when it wasn't yet fired up into an earthenware receptacle, and therefore it could even be that our Tana of a Mishnah is like a mayor. That's one version. Those say a different version. Rav Yisrael said that the Tana of our Mishnah that holds Pchisas Haner, which is pushing your fist into the clay that you want to make the lamp out of, even though you didn't fire up in the furnace yet, is making it into a mana, is a different Tana. Lezer Tzadiki, who he says that before you carve out the receptacle, it's not a vessel, but if you carve it out, then it's making it into a receptacle, again, even though you didn't heat up in the fire. Where do we find this? It's not like the Mishnah says it's idiots. Mishnah says, Ulfasin Chordonias, which Gemara is shortly going to explain. These are the plates, the platters that they use by the villagers, which they're not from the big cities, and they're not so particular about how beautiful are their vessels. And the moment that they spread out the plate of earthenware, they'll already eat meat on it, and they won't even wait till they actually even carve it out, and that they make it into like a receptacle, and for sure not, they don't wait till they heat up in the oven and to make it into earthenware. Just the moment they get some of that earth and they flatten it out, they'll already use it as a plate. So in that state, it's not going to, regarding the halacha of tumas hames in the same oil, it's not going to be mekabel tumah. The reason for that is because you need to have what's called toich. You need to have a receptacle for a kli cheres. Where do we find this? A pasuk in Bamidbar Yotes. It says b'chol kli pesuach, which sounds like that the kli has a pesach, has an opening, has a receptacle. And the same thing is for all tumas maga. The ilfasin charanias, which is just a flat piece of clay, is not going to have tama of the oil hames because it doesn't have a toich. But the tamei is b'masa hazav. It will have halach of tama of being carried by a zav, because a zav, he contaminates a kli cheres, what's called with hesed, which means just to cause it to move. As we learn that in Teres Kainim from the pasuk b'chol kli cheres asher yigu by hazav, which the Gemara their darshans, what does that mean asher yigu by hazav? It's hesete, which causes it to move. Now, since the halach of tumas hesed is actually from the external, you don't need to have a toich. By tumas mes, by all the other tumas, the kli cheres contaminates from the inside of the kli cheres. Hesed is unique that it's just from causing it to move, to project, and that's even if you don't have a toich. Now, the Tanakama holds that so it's considered a kli. Why is it considered kli? Because the villagers, they use it as it is right now, so therefore it's going to be mekabel tumah for something that's roy to the tamid, which is by mas hazav. So the Tanakama is differentiating between oil hames and between mas hazav. Oil hames, which needs, as the pasuk says, toich, it needs to have b'kol chol kli pesuach. There it's not going to have tumah because it doesn't have a toich, but for mas hazav it will have. Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg, who he's the one that we want to show is the halacha, he's the Tana of our Mishnah. He holds no. This flat earthenware platter that hasn't been carved out, hasn't been put into the fire yet, doesn't have any tumah because it's not a kli. So he says, after is b'mas hazav. It's going to be even tahar from having the tumah of the zav causing it to move. The official enigma malach. Then he says because it hasn't yet been finished its production, you didn't even carve it out yet. Oh, the diuk is that if it had at least chakika, if it was at least carved out, then it would be tummy from the fact that he's only disagreeing regarding the ilfasim, which is that doesn't even carved out yet. Obviously, that according to Rabbi Lezer, that chakika would make it into a mana, and therefore says Rabbi Yosef, he's the town of our Mishnah, holds that at least if it had what we call peichsenes aner, if you just carved it out, then it would already have a halacha of a kli, and therefore you're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov. Again, these are two different halachas, but they're the same criterion. One is to be a kli to mekabel tumah, one's a kli to be mesakin mana on making Yom Tov. But if you do chakika, that's going to make it into that have kabbalas tumah, because saying only when it's not, then it's not. So then also he would hold it would be tikkun mana. The problem is, here also, as in the first version, only Abaya, his Talmud says, wait a second. Maybe where do we find Elazar Tzaddik over there when he says that, yeah, since you didn't do chakika, it's not mekabel tuma, but we're being medaik, if you did chakika, we're mekabel tuma. That's because el dechazle kabula b'midi. That's because when you do the chakika, when you push in and you make from the platter into a big fat bowl, that it has utility beforehand. And therefore, yeah, before chakika not, because you can end up doing chakika, but al kaponim it's going to have a halacha of tumah because it's right to mekabel something. Halacha over here by the lamp, by chazi, when you didn't fire it up in the oven yet, so you can't use it now as a lamp yet because it's still wet, it's moist, the earth. So what are you going to use it for? That you're saying chakik is going to make it into a kli ready. So like we said in the first version, the Gemara says again, like kabula pshiti, you could put in some coins, and that could be a moist earth. That doesn't make a difference, and therefore it has utility, and therefore it could be a kli, and that's why, yeah, it would be considered as masaket mana, and therefore that's forbidden to be done on Yom Tov. And again, so the Tanna Mishnah, Rabbi Yisrael is either saying it's Remeir, as we find by what's considered Gemar Melacha, or Beitzah Daf, who, as we see from the inference of his opinion by Beitzah Daf, is that if you just did the Chakika, it would be considered Gemar Melacha. Now, related discussion, the Gemara says, Tanna B'Alon B'Braisa, as we said in our Mishnah, in Peiches in the Saner, now go ahead and push in the earth to make a receptacle for a lamp. And you now make these ilfosn charonis that we just spoke about, these flat platters that the villagers use, and I'll make that on Yom Tov. Whereas Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg, he says, no, you're allowed to make that on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, my charonis, what are these ilfosn charonis? And Rabbi Yehuda says, ironias. The Gemara says, my ironias. Mabai says, tzoich hakalayos, like we've been explaining all along, these are the plates of the villages, which Shimon Gamliel holds, you didn't make anything, because it's not considered as a kli. Like we mentioned before, this machlek is if it's considered kli, and whereas the Tanna Kama held that no, it is considered making a kli, and therefore you would be forbidden to make it as masaker mana on Yom Tov. Now we said in the Mishnah that the einois and b'chama, you're not allowed to make charcoal on Yom Tov. So Gemara says pshita, obviously l'may chazu. What's it fit for that you would think that you'd be able to do a malacha on Yom Tov? So Rabbi Chia says, no, it's necessary, meaning if you want to give it over to those who would heat up the hot water in the bathhouses, for that day, meaning even though it is l'tzarech Yom Tov, so you would think that you'd be allowed to do that. That was saying that no, you're not allowed to go ahead and make the meaning, because you're allowed to heat up things on Yom Tov, that you're allowed to do. But we're saying that so the Gemara is saying what's the chiddush that you're not allowed to make the charcoal, which we're saying is like Rashi had said in the Mishnah that's considered as a kli. Well, of course you're not allowed to make it. So it says no, because you need the coal to use to heat up water. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. What do you think you're allowed to go ahead and heat up water on Yom Tov? But we said in Masechta Shabbos that they were goizer on rechitza, and even if it was heat up actually from before Shabbos started. For sure, to heat up water on Yom Tov, that was never permitted to go ahead and do. So what's the havamina to say that you need to tell me that you now make the charcoal to heat up the water, but you're not allowed to even heat up water anyway for the bathhouses? Says the Gemara, could Amar Rava, like Rava says, lahazia. We're talking about where they would actually take the coals inside, and people would come in and they would make a shvitz to sweat. Before the gzer that they made on sweating, that this Mishnah was said, that's what Rava says elsewhere. It says, also the coals, what do you need it for? That it's even though you're making it for schwitzing, which you're allowed to do on Yom Tov, and that was saying that even so, it's going to be forbidden because you're making this into a kli, and therefore it's forbidden. But again, we have to tell you that would be forbidden because you would think that it is for a permitted use. It is for a Yom Tov use, which is for schwitzing, which you're allowed to do. The Mishnah said, now I'll go ahead and cut a wick into two. But Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to cut it by a fire. So the Gemara says, wait a second. What's the difference that you're saying you're not allowed to cut it with a knife as continued on the base because they're masakin month? Because it was one wick, and now you're making 2 wicks. Voila. You made a mother, you made a vessel, you made a wick. But or Nami says the Gemara, but then I don't understand Rabbi Yehuda. With the fire too, masakin month. What's the difference if you're doing with a knife or you're doing with with a wick, with a flame. You're still fixing a mana. So the Gemara taught, what you do is you cut it with a fire befish day neighbors, like this picture illustrates, where these are, and some people still have these types of lamps that they found. That what they used to do is they would have the oil receptacle, and then you have a wick coming out. So what you technically could do is you put the two ends into the two lamps. If let's say you have to light them both at the same time, you light it in the middle of the wick. So it's not obvious that you're doing it for tikkun mana. You're just doing it to light. So therefore, since it's not evident, therefore that's what you're just saying is that you're allowed to go ahead, because it's not really tikkun mana. It's lighting the wick in the center, and you're lighting both, and therefore you'll be able to separate, and you'll be able to have two lamps. Now, Amr Rav Nasan bar Abba Amar Rav, he says, Moichetin es absila b'yamtiv. You're allowed to go ahead, and what happens is on the top of the wick, it becomes like a little bit charcoaly. So you're allowed to go ahead and remove that, because, and the chiddush in that is not really considered making the kli. It's already a wick. You're just taking off that charcoaly part on the top, which as the Gemara explains, my meichtin. Rav Chanina bar Shloimy, he says la'aduye, which means to remove chushcha, the black, the charcoal which darkens the light. That's permitted to be done on Yom Tov. Additionally, says the Gemara, Tani bar Kapar taught a brayso that vav dvam nemer b'psila, 6 halachas that were said regarding a wick on Yom Tov. Gimel hachmer, but Gimel hakol, 3 as stringencies and 3 as leniencies, as the Gemara explains. Lahachmer has a stringency, which is in goyden oisel getchil b'Yom Tov. Now, initially go ahead and weave, braid the wick on Yom Tov, again, because you're making a kli. And the or you now go ahead and singe it in the fire that's also making a kli. That was originally where the meaning was that the husband lights the Shabbos candles because it makes it into some see today you don't have that because we already have it, but that's the singeing it in the fire. And also the third one is now going cut into 2, which is the halach we mentioned before, which is because that's making it into a wick. Now lahakal, the three leniencies, one is mamach b'yad. You're allowed to go ahead and press it together by hand, because even though that's tikkun, but that's kalach yad, it's not in the normal way, it's in the indirect way, so that you're allowed to do. B'shur b'shem, you're allowed to soak it in oil. And the third one is b'chutcha ba'or, that we said from Rabbi Yehuda, you're allowed to cut it by the flame, b'fish neris, in the opening of the 2 lamps, like we said, for that of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, once we're quoted from Rav Nasan bar Abba Amar Rav, so now the Gemara quotes him with some Agadic teachings. Atire Bavel, the wealthy of Bavel, Yordi Gehenim, they're going to ultimately go down into Gehenim. And the reason is the Gemara is going to explain because they're not merciful to do and give charity. Kihad the Shabsai Bamarenis. This individual, Ikla Bavel, he went to Bavel. He asked from the people in Bavel some merchandise to make money. Say, look, we'll go 50-50. I'll do the work. You just provide the merchandise. No one wanted to give many merchandise to do business with. So he came asking them for food. They didn't give him any food. Amar says, these people, these wealthy people of Babel, they're from the Eir of Rav, which was from those people that got mixed into the Jewish people when they left Mitzrayim, all the Goyim who wanted to be part of the Yidden, which don't have the yichus of the Jewish people. Because the pasuk says in Devarim, says, Hashem will give you rachamim, meaning that you'll have rachmanis on people, and then he'll have mercy on you. Meaning, whoever has mercy on the people, then we know that he's from the descendants of Avram Avinu. Why? Because as Rashi brings, the pasuk says, so someone who has rachamim, he's like it was promised to your fathers, he's from the zera of the Avis, he's from the descendants of Avram Avinu. Someone who's not merciful on the people, like the wealthy of Babel did not have mercy on the people. But you know that he's not from the sense of Rav Avinu, they're from the Eir of Rav. So to another teaching from Rav Nasan bar Abba Amar Rav, he says, whoever is anticipating, whoever is dependent on other people's tables, the world is dark for him. Because he's dependent on other people, doesn't have his own table. Shnemak says the pasuk in Eir. He wanders for bread. Aye, where is he? Yada, you should know kinachin biyadai, because it's prepared for him yom cheshach, a dark day. which we see that it's the Schwarzwald Eigen as a mensch, he has to go to everyone else's table. He says, and his life is also not a life, which actually brings us turn to the following Beitzah. There are three people that their life is not a life. Who are these three people? Someone who has to anticipate his friend's table, which obviously has to give us some compassion for people that they don't have their own table to be by, have to be by other people. Someone whose wife dominates and rules over him. And the third one is the Misha Yisur Moshe Magufa, and someone who has afflictions that rule his body. Some say so too if he only has one article of clothing, but you can't wash it because he has to wear it, and the lice always pains him because it's not washed, so that's also someone that his life is not a life. Now the Tanakama, who didn't quote if he only has one shirt, because because it's not like you don't have a life, because you could look at your clothing and you could delouse it, like it's called, get rid of the lice from your clothing, and therefore he didn't hold that would be considered chayiv ein chayiv. Then halacha, the next Mishnah, continuing with the halacha of tikkun mana, ein shayvenes acheres. You're not allowed to break a piece of earthenware, meaning when they would roast fish on the griddle, like Rashi says in the grill, so you can't break a piece of earthenware, and bein chaytchan hanyar, you can't cut a piece of paper. Litzlis by maliach. If you want to let's go ahead and roast a salted piece of fish, what they would do is they would cut reeds, or they would cut a piece of straw, or they would break an earthenware, or they would cut a paper, and they would soak it in water, and they would put the paper on the grill, and that you now do on Yom Tov. Why? Because and they would do it because you couldn't put the fish straight on the metal because it would burn the fish. You needed something like in between the coals, the metal and the fish. So you'd put like some type of a tray. So that you now do on Yom Tov, again because of tikkun mana. You're making this tray that you can't do on Yom Tov. And also the ingorf and tan of the karayim. You not if let's say it fell in from some of the clay, the debris of the oven fell into the oven, you're not allowed to shovel it out, because that's also considered tikkun mana. You're really fixing the oven, which Rashi says that's like Rabbanon, who they hold machshir oichel nefesh is forbidden, because your machshir oichel nefesh is permitted. You're allowed to fix the oven, which is to make the food. Our mission is not going like that. So therefore, you're not allowed to do tikkun mana, you're not allowed to shovel out the oven and the stove. Oven machavshin, but what you could do is, you could push down, you could smooth down the ashes and the earth to make it smooth, where it shouldn't touch the bread, which is, they would take the pieces of dough and they would slap it against the walls of the oven, and it would get burnt if it touched the coal. So that you're allowed to go ahead and just smooth down the ashes for the baking. And the ema kifin, another law says the Mishnah is that you now go ahead and put near each other shtei chavias, 2 barrels, and you would have the fire between the 2 barrels, like this picture illustrates, that you're not allowed to go ahead and put the 2 barrels together, lishves alena segedera, to put the pot on top of that. Meaning, anytime you're putting a pot on the fire, it's called shvisa. And when you don't have a tripod, like Rashi says, if they didn't have a certain metal vessel, or let's say they don't have an oven of earthenware that had a hollow, so what they would do is they would literally just make a fire, and you can't put it right on the fire, put it out, so they would put 2 barrels, and you put the pot on top of it. So that's forbidden to be done on Yom Tov, because that's similar to binyan, and rabbinically it's forbidden because it looks like you're making an oil. Therefore you can't put 2 barrels together and put the pot on top of that. It's like making a tripod to cook the pot. So to vein samichan asakadeir bebikas. You can't support the pot with logs of wood. Why?
The pot is the problem, not the barrels.
What?
The oil is
Yeah.
when you do the pot.
Right, on top of the barrels, right. Right, yeah, the barrels themselves wouldn't be considered oil. Those like the mechitzas and that would be like the top of it, yes.
So that's also not going to be the issue of the fire. You cannot just do it even when there is no fire underneath.
Right. Right, yeah, exactly. It's just only kids would do that without the fire. But and then another halacha is that you can't support a pot with a tree stump. Why? Because this Tana holds that the purpose of eitzim, like of logs, are only used for fuel, for firewood. So therefore, as we've seen this a few times in this Masechta, muktzah is not necessarily universal. It could be for certain things. So it's muktzah for all other tashmish. For all other purposes, it's considered as muktzah. So therefore, you can't use it as holding up a pot. And v'chein bedelis. So too with a door, which right now the Gemara initially assumes, what they're means to say is that you cannot support a pot, just like you can't support it with a log, you can't support it with a door. And the Gemara's going to ask, who's using a door to support a pot? But al kapanim, you definitely cannot support a pot with logs because it's considered muktzah for that utility. Another halacha is ve'ein manhigin es be'imah b'makol. You cannot lead an animal with a stick in Rishus Harabim, which initially the Gemara assumes because you can't use wood that wasn't used as a kli from before Yom Tiv, because again, a piece of wood is only used for fueling the fire. If you want to use it for something else, it would have the same halacha. Like we said, you can't use it to support the pot, and you can't use it to lead the animal because it's considered muktzah, a stecken, stam, a piece of wood. It can't be used for anything else. But Rabbi Shimon Mati says no, it's permitted. You're allowed to use that stick to lead the animal on Yom Tov. First, the Gemara goes back to the halacha of the Reisha, which we said you can't do all these breaking the earthenware and cutting the paper to use to roast the salt and fish on the grill. Says Gemara, my time, what's the problem? Says Gemara, because you're making a tray by cutting this piece of earthenware or this piece of paper. So the Mishnah continues, said the ingurf and tana b'karayim. You're not allowed to shovel out if you have debris in the oven or the stove. You're not going to be able to. It's going to get in the way. You're not allowed to shovel that out. However, the Gemara says the Tanit of Chia bar Yosef committed of Nachman. He taught a brisa that says v'imiyef shalefas elm can go, but if it wouldn't be possible to bake unless you shoveled it out, then it would be permitted. Which Rashi brings that would be like a bihuda, not like we said before from our Mishnah, who he said that hechshtei oichel nefesh are permitted, and therefore you would be able to shovel out the oven so that you could then go ahead and make the food inside of it. And the Gemara actually brings stories related to this, that the Beitzah Daf, the wife of Rabbi Nafala Aricha, she had what's called a half a brick that fell into bitanur, into the oven, b'yom tov, on Yom Tov. It meaning got detached from the wall of the oven and fell into the oven. So Rabbi her husband, Rabbi said to her, Chazi, si, da'no, da mi, rifta mal yosabin, I want to have a good loaf of bread on Yom Tov. In other words, basically he was indicating to shovel out the oven to get rid of that half a brick that it shouldn't touch the bread, that's going to touch the walls, which is where the doughs are. And like the halacha, like we said before, if it's not going to allow you to bake, so then you're allowed to go ahead and shovel out the oven on Yom Tov. So too, only Rabbi L'Shameh, Rabbi said to his attendant, Teveli bar avzu, I want you to roast for me a goose in the oven. Now, their ovens were small, and they had openings on the top. So what they would do is they would hang the roast inside, and then they would close the opening, and then it would get roasted inside. And he told him, the izdar mecharucha, I want you to be careful, make sure it doesn't get singed. In other words, shovel out, he was telling him, shovel out the oven, so that there shouldn't be on the bottom anything high sticking out, like a half a brick, or a stone that was already heated up in the oven, which is going to touch the roasted meat, and it's going to burn it. So again, he was telling him that you're allowed to shovel it out, because I want to make sure that I have some good cooked goose on Yom Tov. Now, a related discussion, the Gemara brings Amali Ravina Ravashi. Ravina said to Ravashi, Amalon Ravacha Mahutzel, Ravacha from Hutzel told us that you, the master Ravashi, that the servants of my master, what they do is they smear around the cover of the opening of the oven with clay. And the reason why they do that is like a sealer, that the heat from the roast should not come out, because any wind that comes in is actually harmful for the roast, as we've said in Masechta Shabbos. And essentially he was telling him, we're wondering, how could the master let his servants do this? This is what's called megabil, which is kneading the clay. If you want to put it around the opening, you have to basically push it in, which is a toilah, the derivative of lush, of kneading. Because the same thing in the Play-Doh, you're not allowed to do all these things, the same thing, the same activity as lush, like we do for dough, which you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to do the same thing with earth, which is making into clay. How does the master let his servants do this? So Malay says, no, we live by the beach, by the edge of the Euphrates. What? By the banks by the banks of the Euphrates that we rely on. So we don't need to go ahead and knead the earth, the clay, because at the banks of the Euphrates, the clay is already kneaded. That was the consistency of the clay of the earth, and therefore we don't do. It's not a problem about Magal. Now the Gemara, however, does make two following qualifications. But this was only said if they already marked it off from yesterday, that he made a sign and they moved it to the side that they're going to use that, so that there wouldn't be a problem about that it wasn't prepared, that it should be a problem about moktzah. And moreover, Amar Rabbeinu, he says bikit mashari. Additionally, if you have just a paste of ashes and water, that you're allowed to knead that and to smear that, because that's what's called it's not bar gibel. It's not something that can be kneaded really. It's like it doesn't really get that thick consistency, and therefore that also would be permitted to go ahead and smear on the oven on Yom Tov. Now we said in the Mishnah that Ve'ema kivin shtei chabis. Now I'll put together two barrels to put the pot on top of that, because there would be a problem. But Baina is considered as building, which is one of the Malachas for Ben Yom Tov. However, Rav Nachman says Avanim shel Beitzah Kisei. The stones of the lavatory, which they would have these big stones, which they would put it near each other to be like a type of a hollow seat, and they would sit on it in the fields in the designated place for relieving oneself. So those two stones, mutar l'tzadim Yom Tov, you're allowed to put them near each other on Yom Tov. I asked, wait a second. Rabbi asked Rabbi Nachman from our Mishnah. We said he's now put together two barrels to put on top of it the pot. So the same thing's over here. You're putting together the two stones and you're sitting on it. So you're making a type of a oil. So Amalei said to him, "No shani hasim. There's tiv mishum dekah." But what do you mean? Like Rashi says, there when you put on the pot, you're making a gag. You're making a roof by putting the pot on top of those two barrels. But here's no roof. He's just putting two stones together, and you're sitting on top of that. So on that, Amalei Rabbi Zutel Rashi says, "Wait a second. If that's the case, so bani itztava. If someone makes an itztava, which is a type of a chair of a structure made out of bricks and clay, if you make that on B'Yom Tov, where you're not making an oil, because what happens is over there you're not, even though if there's a covering, but oil is only if you need the space beneath it. It's actually one of the differences between wearing a cap and our black hats. Even though you're not allowed to wear a cap that has a 3.18-inch brim because it's an oil, but our black hats you're allowed to, because Rabbi Yashu says you're not using it for the space beneath it, you're just wearing it for the cover of Shabbos or Yom Tov. So by the Itztava, you don't need the space beneath it. So there's no real oil. So says the Mahachanami the Shari, so you're allowed to make an Itztava, you're allowed to make this structure on Yom Tov. So Malay says, no, I'll tell you why. Hasam over there by the Itztava is Binyan Keva. That's a permanent structure. So Asher Torah, the Torah says that when you make it permanent structure, you're not allowed to make it. Binyan Arai, when it's a temporary structure, which is not meant to last, like when you're putting together two barrels or two stones, Lo Yasser Torah, the Torah doesn't make that forbidden. But a permanent structure, you're not allowed to make, like you have by the, so although you're not making an oil, but it's a permanent structure, that's going to be forbidden. But the Rabbanan says you're not make even a temporary structure, like you have by the two barrels, and you have a pot on top of it, because of the similarity to a permanent structure. Now, but by the bathroom, by the two stones, because of the honor for the dignity of Kavod Abriyas, Rabbanan weren't good. So again, those are the three levels. Regarding the making the Itztava, that's a permanent structure that you're not allowed to make. B'chlal, that the Torah says you don't make a permanent structure that you make with the Itztava. Regarding making the two barrels together, you're right, that's only a binyan arai, but Rabbanan were geyser. But here, although you're right, it is a temporary structure, really you should not be able to make the two stones together because of the Rabbanan, but still because of Kavod Abriyas, a person is allowed to go ahead and put them together. Now, related, the Gemara brings the Amar Bihudi says, "Hai Medurta," a large bonfire, a large fire that they would make in front of the ministers, in front of royalty, and they would make it like a type of a building, which they would make walls on 4 sides, and they would put wood on top of this pyre, so it would be similar to an oil. So on that says Rabbi Yehuda, Malmal lamata. If you do it from the top down, which is that if you start from the roof of this fire, and then you organize beneath it the wooden walls, so then shari, that's permitted to be done in Yom Tov. But mamata lamala, but from bottom up, which is if you first organize the wood of the walls and then you make on that the roof, also that's going to be forbidden because that's what's called derech binyan. You're doing it the way of a structure. Again, the same thing of the halacha we're talking about from our Mishnah. You now go ahead and you have to do barrels and put the pot on top of it. You now make the walls, although you're allowed to make a fire on Yom Tov, that's necessary, but you can't do it in making this binyan. So to continue to talk about Gimel and Aleph, B'chein Beitzah. Same thing as regarding eggs. What does that mean? So they would have these large eggs that they would put on this like hollow vessel, like a tripod, or on the grill. So you're not allowed to go ahead and put the vessel first and then put the eggs on top of it. Rather, what you have to do is you have to first hold the egg in your hand, and you put the egg on top of that, and then you put the vessel on the coals. Again, so that you shouldn't do like the sage of the binyan. Basically, it has to be from top down and not from bottom up. And same thing is v'chein gedera, like we said in the halacha of the Mishnah. So let's say when you have these 2 barrels for the pot, you can't go ahead and put the barrels together and then put the pot on top of it. Rather, you have to first hold the upper one in the ear, hold it in your hand, and then put the barrels beneath it, around it, so that you're doing it from top down. And v'chein porya, same things regarding a bed, where they would have the royal beds, that they would take it apart and put it back together again. So you now go ahead and put legs up first, and then put the bed frame around it, and then put the hide, the skin, which is the bedspread, on top of that. No, first you spread out the leather, and you have 2 people holding it in their hands, and then you bring the bed frame, and then you tie the straps of the leather onto that, and then you go and you put up the legs, and you put the bed frame on top of that. And the last one, b'chein chavita, so to regarding a barrel, where if let's say you're organizing your storehouse and you put 1 barrel on top of 2, you can't put 2 barrels and put 1 on top of that, again, because that would be derech binyan, that would be the Issa D'Rabbanan. Rather, what you have to do is you have to do it with a shinoi, which is first put the top barrel and then put the 2 barrels beneath it, again, because of this halacha of the rabbinic Isser of making oil. Thank you to anytime.